How much does a Royal Oak cost? Well, in today's modern watch market, it's a little bit difficult to assess, but let's go more in depth and discuss it further. So the Royal Oak line is one that is rich with history. It was originally designed by Gerald Genta back in 1972, and ever since then, really AP has made a number of faithful iterations, be it in the jumbo reference or be it in the numerous references that have been produced after the fact, be it, for example, in the vintage versions or in the modern versions. Over the last 50 years, AP has really made a number of variations of the Royal Oak, and so as a result, not only do you get a number of different styles, but also a number of different price points. And so today, I wanted to look over the various price points of what a Royal Oak costs and what you can get a Royal Oak for now today, and what I feel maybe are some of the hidden gems of the overall line. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of what everything costs, let's first take into consideration what ultimately factors into that cost. Well, when it comes to, for example, vintage references, it will depend namely first and foremost on supply. How many of these watches are out there? And say, for example, the A serial 5402, there's only about 2,000 known to ever be produced, and that's between the steel and, for example, the two-tone or gold versions. Not to mention the following references, the B serial, for example, it being the rarest of the original Royal Oaks, with only about 1,000 produced overall. And so rarity is one of the major factors in the price of the Royal Oak. Of course, secondary would be condition, namely because when it comes to vintage references, or really any watch in particular, condition is probably one of, if not the most important things. And then we have to take into consideration also the provenance. Does it have the original box? Does it have the original papers? And does it have even, for example, maybe any of the accessories that were sold along with the Royal Oak? All of these factors will generally affect price in different ways, both for vintage and for modern. It's also important to take into consideration what the material of the Royal Oak is used. Now, generally speaking, in the jumbo references, we would typically see either in steel, sometimes in gold, either yellow gold, white gold, or rose gold. However, for the most part, generally speaking, most AP Royal Oaks are found in steel, as this was the metal that it was originally produced in. However, we've also seen some off the beaten path AP examples, say in platinum, say for example in ceramic, and say for example even in two-tone, sometimes having tantalum and yellow gold, or sometimes having bimetal configurations that make it a little bit rare, potentially more collectible, and again skewing the price one way or another. So let's start, for example, with the jumbo reference. Now, the jumbo reference AP is distinguished mostly for its 39mm case size, the fact that it's typically a two-hand time-only watch with a date, and then ultimately it skews with respect to, again, case metal and the variation it was produced in. Now, if we go back to the vintage references, the 5402s, again in the A, B, C, or D serial, these are watches that will vary tremendously in price, anywhere from 100,000 plus, really because of supply. The B serial being the most elusive, with only 1,000 units ever to have estimated to have been made. The A serial, it being the first with only about 2,000 ever made, and then the C and D serials are ultimately a toss-up between how many have been made, and no official numbers have ever been produced. Now, there's also the later references to take into consideration, the 148002, the 15002, as well as the 15202 that they actually did twice, once in 2002, and then later updated for the 40th anniversary in 2012. And this year, AP commemorated the 50th anniversary of the release of the Royal Oak back in 1972 with a new jumbo reference, the reference 16202. Now, this updated the previous reference 15202 slightly, with changes in the dial and changes in the overall aesthetic, but overall the look and feel of the watch is generally the same. However, the major change was to the movement. Prior to the release of the 16202, the 15202 and all the generations previously were powered by a JLC movement, namely the JLC 920, which is a tried and tested workhorse and extremely reliable. However, by today's standards, it is a little bit outdated, given the fact that ultimately it isn't an in-house movement, which is important to many people, and secondly, given the fact that it did not have a quickset date, which this new caliber ultimately fixes. So when it comes to ultimately pricing these out, again, there are a number of factors that I mentioned earlier. However, there is kind of a determinant in price, namely on the fact of where the current market is. At the end of the day, the Royal Oak has been on the market for almost 50 years, and so we can get a pretty good gauge of overall pricing. Starting, for example, with the original reference 5402. Generally speaking, if you're going to get a steel model of the original reference, it's going to cost you upwards of $125,000. Again, depending on the serial, the material, and so on, just because of the overall limited supply. Even if you were to get, for example, a later serial, there simply aren't that many out there that are known to exist, and aren't that many out there ultimately in great condition. And so you're ultimately going to pay a premium for buying an original reference 5402 Royal Oak in whatever serial. So generally speaking, the price will range from about $125,000 and onward. To celebrate the 20th anniversary, AP released the 14802. Now this was a reference, again, that was very limited in overall production, with only about 1,000 pieces ever known to have been made. And so again, the price generally reflects that. If you're going to get a steel model of this reference, it's going to cost you upwards of $150,000. Next came the 15002 reference, one of the most elusive jumbo-sized Royal Oaks, with only about 200 to have estimated to have ever been made. And so you definitely will pay a premium to ultimately find and purchase one in good condition. And again, depending on the provenance and overall condition of the watch, you can expect to pay at least $160,000 to $170,000 at the very, very minimum. Next up, we get to the modern reference 15202. As I mentioned earlier, this was a reference that was produced and started in 2002 and later updated in 2012 to commemorate the release of the 40th anniversary of the Royal Oak. And so again, these will vary pretty generally in price depending on whether you get the older model, the newer model, or anything kind of in between. When it comes to the 15202 reference, although there were generally different models and different dial colors, for example, I'm going to focus really on the one that's most sought after, which is the blue dial reference. And I think you can expect to pay upwards of $75,000 for a complete set, box and papers, and one for good condition. Obviously, the price can skew, especially in today's market, because ultimately the Royal Oak has witnessed quite a dramatic shift in overall price and demand. However, I think that is generally speaking around where the market is starting to stabilize, and we've actually started to see prices tick up. If we were to take a look at the gold examples, be it in yellow gold, in white gold, or in rose gold, again, these will vary in price tremendously because the demand for the white, the yellow, and the rose gold will each fluctuate. But overall, you're definitely going to be paying upwards of $150,000 to $170,000 easily for one in good condition and in a full set. Again, a watch that has definitely witnessed a decline in price, but is starting to ultimately stabilize and in some cases actually starting to increase in price once again. Overall, this is pretty impressive for a watch that has witnessed a pretty dramatic decline in price, at one point trading upwards of 100, even hitting 120,000, whereas now you can get probably a newer example in about the 100 range. So I think overall it's a watch that, yes, sure, it has dramatically dropped in price, you know, from 120,000 to, say, for example, about 100,000 for a brand new example. But again, one that was trading only a couple of years ago in the sub $60,000 range, right? So I think it's definitely a watch that is not only iconic, but a great one if you're looking for one that retains its value very well. So I think with respect to the 15202 reference, it's definitely one that you can't go wrong with. If we were to move on, for example, to the newer reference, the reference 16202, it's hard to see where the market price will ultimately be. This was a watch that came out of the gate upwards of $300,000 at one point. So, you know, prices have definitely softened since then, and it's tough to really gauge where the market will kind of stabilize at. Ultimately because, well, there's one reference this year that will be produced with the 50th anniversary rotor, and of course the later references not being produced with the 50th anniversary rotor. It's hard to also gauge how long AP will produce this reference. Will they do it for, say, another 20 years like they did the 15202, maybe make slight incremental adjustments to the same reference? So again, there's a lot of question marks surrounding it, and generally speaking, if I had to say I had to bet on one, I would probably go the 15202, just because it is the modern reference and we know that it is now discontinued. I'd also like to briefly touch on some of the three-hand Royal Oaks, namely in the modern references in the modern case sizes, the 15300, the 15400, and the 15500, which have witnessed a pretty dramatic fluctuation in price also in the same way that the 15202 or the other jumbo reference sizes Royal Oaks have. With respect to the 15300, that's actually a reference I'm very partial to, first and foremost because of its case size. It is in the original jumbo 39mm case size, which I think is really the best for the Royal Oak line. This was a watch that was originally released in 2005. An interesting quirk about it that I feel will make it much more collectible than it is right now is the fact that it was the first in-house movement Royal Oak, With respect to price of the 15300, this is a reference that will vary depending on the dial color. The cheapest being the silver, which can be had around the $38,000 to $40,000 range, again depending on condition and if it comes with box and papers, and then upwards from there if it has a black dial or a blue dial, it achieving, for example, $45,000+ for a black dial and a blue dial trading in the $60,000+ range. I think if you're looking also for a great value, I would look at the 15300, specifically in rose gold with the silver dial. These trade around the $40,000 range and can be had even on bracelet for the same price approximately as a blue dial one online, which is, in my opinion, crazy considering the fact that you're getting an all gold watch versus a steel watch with a blue dial. Does ultimately the dial color justify the premium? Personally, I think it does, just because the blue dial of the Royal Oak is iconic, but at the same time, I do see a lot of value in getting a full gold watch for the same price. Next, let's move on to the first of the kind of larger case size three-hand Royal Oaks, and that is the reference 15400, which was originally released in 2012 and spanned a 7-year production run. Now, this used the same base movement as the 15300. It had a slightly larger case size, and overall it's actually a lot less collectible than the, say for example, the newer or updated version of it, the reference 15500. With respect to the 15400, again, this is another watch that will vary depending on price. The silver dial being probably the least collectible, which can be had around the $40,000 range, maybe a little bit higher, and ultimately increasing in price towards the black and the blue dial. The black being around the $50,000 range and the blue dial being upwards of $60,000+ to $70,000. So again, one that definitely trades at a higher premium, but definitely has come down quite dramatically in price and represents, in my opinion, a really good value if you're looking for a well-priced 41mm Royal Oak, especially in the current market, one where we're starting to see Royal Oak prices stabilize, and I think could potentially see an increase in price as we approach the December months. Next came the reference 15500, which succeeded the 15400 during its release in 2019, and this was a watch that actually had quite a short production run overall. It was only produced from 2019 to 2022 when AP discontinued it, and now released the reference 15510, which has some slight upgrades, but it's pretty much the same watch, if we're being honest. The 15500 is a reference I feel that does have the potential of being a future collectible, just because it was done in such a short production and because it is a much cleaner aesthetic overall than the 15500. Again, one of the original kind of 41mm or larger case size three-hand Royal Oaks that AP has now started to produce, and short production run. And again, one that definitely dramatically varies in price between the silver or the gray dial, which trade both around the $45,000 to $50,000 range, the black dial being a little bit more expensive in the $50+ range, and the blue dial being around the $75+ range. Now, again, this is a crazy dramatic shift in price because the blue 15500 at one point was fetching about $110,000, right? Now trading around the $80,000 if you're getting a brand spanking new example. I mean, I think you're getting a lot of value for a watch that was only produced for 4 years, that is super limited overall, and whose demand is super high. With respect to the new reference that succeeded the 15500, the 15510, again, it's a watch that's very difficult to really assess its market price and where it will settle. It's very new still. It still hasn't even stopped being produced with the 50th anniversary rotor. So again, one that I would say wait until you see where the market shakes out, unless you absolutely want one. But again, I think it's one that definitely will be collectible, especially because it was released as a tribute to the 50th anniversary of the Royal Oak. Now, for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to present to you guys, say for example, the AP Royal Oak chronographs or even the perpetual calendars, which are extremely collectible and actually in many cases sell at a premium from the, for example, jumbo reference Royal Oaks, which are traditionally the most collectible. But ultimately, I would suggest if you do want to get an in-depth pricing gauge, click the link down in our description below, which actually goes over the pricing, the history, as well as the overall gauge of the market of the Royal Oak, both in terms of the jumbo reference, the three-hand reference, as well as the chronographs, perpetual calendars, and not to mention also the Royal Oak Offshore, which was originally released to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Royal Oak back in 1992. So guys, this wraps up my video on the overall price guide of the AP Royal Oak. I definitely would suggest hitting the link in our description to get a more in-depth guide of where you can find AP Royal Oak pricing at, especially in a market where it's fairly uncertain and fairly turbulent, but I would say things are looking up for the Royal Oak because prices are starting to stabilize really across the board. And so I think that gives me hope as we reach the kind of months of December and November, and ultimately prices typically tend to trend upwards in these months, naturally because there's a spike in demand. So if I were to tell you, buy a Royal Oak, I would say now is a great time, especially given the fact that they're trading at such a discount from where they were even 6 months ago. Guys, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I really hope that you enjoyed, and I'd love to get your feedback down in the comments below of what videos you'd like to see on the Luxury Bazaar YouTube channel. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you.